Eleanor Reed thought the abandoned mountain pond she purchased for $1 at a county foreclosure auction was just a desperate gamble to save her family from financial ruin after losing her position as a wildlife biologist left them 38 days from eviction with no prospects for employment that could cover their mounting debts and basic survival needs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when her 10-year-old daughter Mia's determination to help restore their new property led her to investigate the murky waters that county records described as biologically dead, they discovered a hidden ecosystem containing rare freshwater pearls and endangered species from the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary, a forgotten conservation project that had conducted groundbreaking environmental research during the 1970s, with detailed records proving that government officials, lumber companies, and mining corporations had spent 60 years systematically covering up ecological destruction that affected over 15,000 acres of pristine wilderness whose remediation potential was deliberately sabotaged to prevent exposure of federal negligence that modern environmental agencies and corporate interests have worked to keep buried. The final unemployment notice had arrived on a Thursday morning with the bureaucratic precision that transformed stable families into cautionary tailies, marking the conclusion of 13 months of systematic financial deterioration that had transformed Eleanor Reed from a respected wildlife biologist earning $86,000 annually at Blue Ridge Conservation Institute to a desperate single mother whose daily existence required mathematical calculations about every expenditure while her 10-year-old daughter Mia watched their previously secure middle-class life dissolve into survival strategies that required adult-level understanding of resource allocation and crisis management that no elementary school student should need to comprehend during formative developmental years. At 39 years old and 14 months removed from her termination during organizational restructuring that had eliminated entire research divisions throughout Appalachia's environmental sector, Eleanor confronted the mathematical reality that her family would be displaced from their rental cabin within 5 weeks unless she could generate income sufficient to cover accumulated arrears, current monthly expenses, and the administrative penalties that property management companies impose on tenants whose payment histories had been compromised by unemployment. Despite previous reliability and professional stability that had characterized their residential record, the 2-bedroom cabin in North Carolina's Pisgah Forest region had served as their family sanctuary for 7 years, a rustic yet comfortable home where Eleanor had maintained exemplary tenant status while advancing through environmental research, positions that had provided steady income growth and professional recognition within the region's expanding conservation industry before budget cuts and research funding reallocation had systematically eliminated positions requiring her specialized expertise in aquatic ecosystems and endangered species preservation. Her professional background reflected 15 years of dedicated advancement through increasingly sophisticated environmental science roles that had begun during her graduate studies at Appalachian State University's Ecological Research Center, where her doctoral research on freshwater biodiversity had attracted attention from leading conservation organizations, whose competitive recruitment efforts had provided multiple employment opportunities and career advancement pathways that had characterized the environmental protection industry's expansion during the early 2000s, when federal research funding and private conservation trusts had supported unprecedented innovation and professional development within ecological preservation fields. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her early career had been spent at Eastern Watershed Alliance, a regional nonprofit that specialized in water quality monitoring and habitat restoration, protocols that required mastery of advanced field techniques. environmental compliance procedures, and conservation management strategies that had provided comprehensive, professional development and technical expertise that would serve as foundation for subsequent career advancement through progressively responsible positions within Appalachia's growing environmental protection network. The transition to Blue Ridge Conservation Institute occurred in 2017 when the organization recruited Eleanor to lead their aquatic biodiversity research division, a position that required directing multi-million-dollar conservation projects and managing teams of field scientists and environmental researchers whose work contributed to breakthrough ecological restoration methods and endangered species protection protocols that had generated 12 federally recognized conservation plans and 38 peer-reviewed publications that documented her technical competence and leadership capabilities within the highly specialized environmental preservation industry. Her specialized expertise encompassed advanced limnology, aquatic biology, ecological statistics, and watershed management processes that had been developed through continuous professional education and research participation that included collaborations with major universities, government conservation agencies, and international environmental organizations whose cutting-edge projects required mastery of sophisticated analytical techniques and regulatory frameworks that characterize legitimate ecological research serving environmental protection objectives while maintaining scientific rigor and methodological precision. The conservation projects under Eleanor's direction had focused specifically on developing novel habitat restoration mechanisms that could overcome ecological degradation and improve biodiversity effectiveness for treatments targeting freshwater ecosystems, endangered aquatic species, and various riparian habitats that required precise environmental intervention and controlled rehabilitation methods that represented significant advancement over existing conservation approaches and restoration systems that had limited effectiveness due to fragmented implementation and monitoring challenges. Her team's most significant achievement had been the development of biocompatible microbial remediation systems that could restore damaged watersheds while introducing beneficial organisms directly to targeted aquatic ecosystems, a breakthrough that had potential applications for treating acid mine drainage, agricultural runoff, and various forms of water pollution that had previously been difficult to address through conventional environmental approaches due to the ecosystem's complex interactions that prevented most restoration methods from reaching affected waterways. The microbial remediation system had undergone 3 years of field testing and ecosystem trials that demonstrated unprecedented effectiveness and ecological safety profiles, generating substantial interest from major environmental agencies in government, conservation departments whose implementation negotiations and partnership discussions had been in progress when organizational restructuring and funding redirections had eliminated Eleanor's position and terminated the research program despite its promising results and conservation potential. But funding reallocation during 2022 and 2023 had systematically eliminated research positions throughout Appalachia's conservation sector as grant funding decreased and environmental organizations reduced long-term research investments in favor of shorter implementation cycles and lower-risk projects that could generate more predictable outcomes without requiring the extended timelines and substantial resource commitments that characterized innovative research programs like Eleanor's freshwater ecosystem restoration research that could have generated substantial ecological benefits and biodiversity preservation if development had continued. Eleanor Reed had responded to their financial crisis with intellectual maturity and analytical capabilities that exceeded normal 10-year-old cognitive development, transforming her into an essential household management partner, despite her chronological age and the psychological burden associated with understanding that their family's continued housing stability depended on precise budgeting decisions. and resource conservation strategies that required mathematical sophistication and emotional resilience, typically associated with adult responsibilities rather than childhood experiences. Her personality reflected a unique combination of her mother's scientific methodology and systematic problem-solving, approaches with natural environmental curiosity and observational skills that had been enhanced through participation in advanced academic programs and science enrichment activities, that had developed her capacity for analytical thinking and hypothesis testing that made her particularly effective at identifying household inefficiencies and developing innovative solutions that conventional adult thinking might overlook due to established assumptions about standard procedures and traditional approaches. Mia's academic performance had consistently placed her in the top percentiles of standardized testing and advanced placement programs that provided enrichment opportunities beyond standard elementary curriculum, including participation in science fairs, environmental camp scholarships, and nature club activities that had developed her understanding of ecological principles, natural systems, and systematic investigation methods that characterize scientific inquiry and environmental problem-solving approaches. Her teachers had repeatedly recommended acceleration into advanced academic tracks and gifted education programs that would provide intellectual challenges and educational opportunities appropriate to her cognitive capabilities and learning preferences. But their financial situation had made participation in specialized programs and educational enrichment activities financially impossible due to associated costs for materials, transportation, and supplementary instruction characterized advanced educational opportunities beyond standard public school offerings. Mia's comprehension of their desperate circumstances was both comprehensive and developmentally inappropriate. She monitored their declining financial resources through shared access to online banking systems that Eleanor had provided to facilitate collaborative budget management, conducted independent research about emergency assistance programs using school computer laboratory internet access, and maintained detailed documentation of their monthly obligations, debt accumulation, and projected timelines that calculated exactly when their remaining assets would be exhausted if alternative income sources weren't secured through employment or entrepreneurial activities. The 10-year-old had voluntarily assumed responsibilities for meal planning and grocery budget optimization that involved complex calculations about nutritional density per dollar spent, comparison shopping methodologies that maximized purchasing power while maintaining adequate nutrition for growing children and job-searching adults, and inventory management systems that prevented food waste while ensuring their household maintained sufficient calorie intake for sustained energy and cognitive function required for interview preparation and academic performance. Her meal planning approach had incorporated understanding of nutritional requirements, dietary balance, and food preparation techniques that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of health science and practical cooking skills that had been developed through independent research and experimentation, when their reduced food budget had required maximizing nutritional value while minimizing expenses through strategic shopping and efficient food utilization that prevented waste while maintaining adequate nutrition for both physical health and cognitive performance. Additionally, Mia had developed systematic approaches to utility conservation and household expense reduction that included detailed monitoring of electricity usage patterns, water consumption tracking, and identification of discretionary spending categories that could be eliminated without compromising essential needs or safety requirements that characterized responsible household management during extended financial emergencies when every dollar represented critical resource allocation decisions affecting their family's immediate survival prospects. Her utility conservation methods had included research into energy-efficient practices, appliance usage optimization, and behavior modifications that could reduce monthly expenses without requiring capital investment or equipment replacement that their financial situation couldn't accommodate. Demonstrating understanding of resource management, principles and environmental science concepts that exceeded typical elementary school educational content and practical application capabilities. The systematic documentation that Mia maintained included detailed tracking of their monthly expenses, debt obligations, assistance program applications, and timeline calculations that showed exactly when their remaining resources would be exhausted if alternative income sources weren't secured. Creating comprehensive financial management systems that provided clear understanding of their crisis timeline and resource allocation requirements that would be necessary for survival and stability achievement. Her documentation methods had incorporated spreadsheet applications, graphical analysis, and projection modeling that demonstrated proficiency with technology applications and mathematical concepts that characterized advanced analytical capabilities and systematic thinking approaches that enabled effective crisis management and strategic planning despite their desperate circumstances and limited resources available for addressing their survival requirements and housing security needs. Eleanor's job search efforts had been exhaustive and strategically focused, including applications to environmental organizations, research institutions, conservation nonprofits, university biology departments, government wildlife agencies, and consulting firms whose employment opportunities had been restricted by hiring freezes, budget constraints, and preference for junior researchers, whose salary requirements aligned with reduced funding. Allocations that had characterized the conservation industry's response to economic pressures and regulatory changes affecting environmental research and restoration implementation. The comprehensive nature of her search had included networking activities within professional organizations such as the American Society of Limnologists and Oceanographers, the Society for Conservation Biology, and the Appalachian Environmental Network. Participation in regional conferences and symposiums, including the annual Freshwater Sciences Conference and the Appalachian Ecosystem Summit. Collaboration with recruitment specialists who specialized in environmental placements, and pursuit of consulting opportunities that could provide temporary income while maintaining professional connections and industry visibility. Her networking efforts had generated multiple informational interviews and professional consultations that had provided insight into industry conditions and employment trends, but had consistently revealed that available positions either required relocation to other regions where her family's financial situation made housing, deposits, and moving expenses impossible, or offered compensation levels that were insufficient to support their household expenses and debt obligations while providing the income stability necessary for maintaining housing security and meeting basic survival requirements. The consulting opportunities that had been explored included project-based environmental assessments, technical writing positions, regulatory compliance consulting, and expert witness services for environmental litigation that could utilize her specialized expertise while providing flexible scheduling that would accommodate continued job searching and family responsibilities, but had generated insufficient income to address their immediate financial crisis or provide sustainable long-term employment security that would enable financial recovery and stability. Government assistance programs had provided minimal support due to eligibility requirements and bureaucratic procedures that assumed temporary unemployment rather than industry-wide career disruption, affecting professionals whose previous income levels exceeded assistance program thresholds, while current circumstances required support levels that weren't available through existing social safety net programs designed for different demographic populations, and economic situations. That didn't account for professional career disruption and specialized employment challenges. The assistance programs that had been investigated included temporary assistance for needy families, supplemental nutrition assistance program, women, infants, and children nutrition program, low-income home energy assistance program, and various local emergency assistance funds that provided limited financial support, but required extensive documentation, waiting periods, and ongoing compliance requirements that consumed significant time and energy while providing insufficient assistance to address their comprehensive financial crisis and housing security needs. The county foreclosure auction notification had been discovered among accumulated mail during the third week of February 2024, announcing public sales of tax-delinquent rural properties whose previous owners had abandoned rather than maintain ongoing county tax obligations and property assessments that exceeded properties' perceived values in North Carolina's economically distressed mountain regions where property abandonment and economic decline had created acquisition opportunities for buyers willing to accept renovation responsibilities and ongoing municipal compliance obligations. The foreclosure auction represented the county's annual effort to return abandoned properties to productive use while recovering accumulated tax obligations and property assessments that previous owners had failed to pay due to financial hardship, property inheritance complications, or strategic abandonment that had left the county responsible for maintenance costs and lost tax revenue that affected municipal budget planning and public service provision throughout economically distressed rural districts that required revitalization and economic development. Eleanor's evaluation of available auction properties had identified the abandoned mountain pond on Blackberry Ridge as potentially suitable for ecological tourism business development, offering natural water resources, scenic mountain views, and sufficient acreage for environmental education facilities and visitor experiences that could enable independent practice establishment rather than continued dependence on employment applications that had consistently failed to generate interviews. Despite her qualifications and professional references documenting reliable performance and technical innovation, the property consisted of a 12-acre parcel with a 3-acre pond, surrounding woodland, a dilapidated cabin, and maintenance shed that county property records indicated could be acquired for accumulated tax liabilities totaling $1,136 in back taxes, municipal fees, administrative costs, and assessment arrears that represented the majority of Eleanor's remaining financial resources, but offered possibilities for business ownership and income generation that traditional employment applications had failed to provide. Her preliminary assessment of the property had revealed natural elements that could support ecotourism operations, including a mountain-fed water source that could potentially be restored to healthy ecosystem status, native forest habitats that could provide wildlife viewing opportunities, and scenic mountain vistas that could be configured for educational experiences and recreational activities that would characterize professional nature-based tourism and environmental education services. The property's acquisition had been completed in early March 2024, leaving Eleanor and Mia with legal ownership but virtually no remaining financial resources for restoration activities or business development expenses that would be required to transform the abandoned property into functional space suitable for ecological tourism operations and visitor services. The Mountain Pond property had been abandoned in 2019 when its previous owner, a local hunting club, had dissolved following declining membership and financial difficulties that had made the property economically unsustainable during pandemic-related recreational restrictions and changing outdoor activity preferences. Following successful property acquisition, Eleanor had conducted initial ecological assessment that revealed extensive rehabilitation requirements and environmental challenges that exceeded her immediate financial resources, but matched her professional expertise, including water quality remediation, habitat restoration, ecological diversity enhancement, invasive species management, and erosion control measures that would be necessary before the property could support healthy ecosystems or be marketed for environmental tourism and educational experiences. The property's environmental condition appeared significantly compromised according to her preliminary assessment, with the pond showing signs of acidification, sedimentation, and oxygen depletion that indicated potential pollution from historical mining activity and agricultural runoff from neighboring properties. While the surrounding woodland remained relatively intact, it showed evidence of past selective logging and required biodiversity enhancement to restore ecological balance and wildlife habitats that would attract visitors and support educational programming. Mia's initial reaction to their property acquisition had been characterized by excitement about potential wildlife encounters and enthusiasm for restoration project participation that reflected her environmental curiosity and desire to contribute meaningfully to their family's crisis resolution through practical activities that could utilize her analytical skills and problem-solving capabilities in ways that school assignments and normal childhood activities couldn't accommodate during their extended emergency situation. The first week of March 2024 had brought unseasonably warm temperatures to the North Carolina mountains that accelerated biological processes in the pond in ways that revealed the ecosystem's most urgent rehabilitation requirements, while simultaneously providing Eleanor and Mia their initial opportunity to explore the property's complete layout and identify restoration priorities that would determine whether their desperate property acquisition could realistically be transformed into viable business space within their non-existent budget and compressed timeline for achieving income generation before their rental termination and family displacement. Eleanor's systematic environmental assessment had been conducted using borrowed equipment that she had acquired through coordination with former colleagues and professional contacts who understood her desperate situation and were willing to provide temporary assistance with basic testing supplies, sampling instruments, and field equipment that enabled comprehensive evaluation of the property's ecological condition, biodiversity status, and restoration requirements that would determine the feasibility of their entrepreneurial venture. The pond's water quality had been her primary concern due to the sophisticated ecological requirements that would be necessary for aquatic tourism operations and environmental education that characterized her intended business model, requiring balanced pH levels, adequate dissolved oxygen, healthy microbial communities, and diverse aquatic species that would ensure ecosystem functionality and educational value during nature-based programming and visitor experiences. Her water quality assessment had revealed that the original pond construction appeared to include sophisticated filtration systems and groundwater recharge capabilities that exceeded typical recreational pond specifications, with infrastructure elements suggesting the water feature had been designed to support specialized aquatic environments and operational requirements, significantly more demanding than normal recreational fishing or aesthetic water features that would have characterized typical mountain property development during the property's original construction and operational periods. The water management infrastructure included dedicated filtering systems, specialized circulation networks, and equipment mounting capabilities that indicated previous installation of sophisticated water quality management and aquatic habitat systems that required engineering specifications exceeding normal recreational pond standards while incorporating features that weren't typical of standard mountain property development and rural recreational infrastructure. Additionally, the water management systems showed evidence of modification and upgrade activities that had occurred during different time periods using materials and installation techniques that differed from original construction methods, suggesting systematic enhancement and expansion of ecological capabilities through professional environmental work that exceeded normal maintenance and repair activities, while incorporating specialized features that weren't documented in available county records or property documentation. Mia's participation in the water quality assessment had been characterized by systematic documentation and analytical observation that reflected her scientific methodology and environmental curiosity, creating detailed inventories of water parameters, ecological indicators, and infrastructure elements that enabled comprehensive understanding of the pond's environmental capabilities and restoration requirements, while identifying anomalies and inconsistencies that suggested historical uses beyond normal recreational activities. Her documentation methods had included photographing water sampling locations and distribution systems, measuring water quality parameters and biological indicators, and researching ecological restoration standards and environmental regulations that would be necessary for legitimate business operations and visitor safety that characterized professional ecotourism services and environmental education activities requiring aquatic ecosystems capable of supporting diverse species and operational continuity requirements. The 10-year-old's ecological knowledge had been developed through independent research and educational enrichment activities that included nature camp participation, science fair projects, and advanced biology programs that had provided understanding of ecosystem principles, water quality analysis, and safety procedures that enabled meaningful contribution to their property assessment, while ensuring her participation in ecological evaluation activities maintained appropriate safety protocols and adult supervision. Her systematic approach to environmental documentation had revealed water management configurations and filtration routing that didn't correspond to normal pond layouts or logical water circulation patterns that characterized typical recreational development, with water pathways and equipment locations that suggested specialized requirements and biological considerations that weren't typical of standard recreational pond systems and rural infrastructure development. During the second week of March, Mia's systematic pond exploration had begun as practical necessity for evaluating water quality and aquatic habitat potential that would be required for restoration planning and business development, but had evolved into comprehensive investigation of underwater features and construction elements that revealed significant inconsistencies between the property's actual configuration and official county records that documented its construction and historical use patterns. The pond had been accessed through standard wading procedures from the shore area, leading to what county records described as a simple recreational fishing pond, an aesthetic water feature that supported property enjoyment and rural lifestyle activities. But Mia's systematic exploration had revealed depth variations and construction features that exceeded normal recreational pond functionality while incorporating elements that suggested specialized operational requirements and ecological measures. Her pond investigation had been conducted using borrowed waders and sampling equipment while maintaining communication with Eleanor, who monitored her exploration activities from the shoreline, ensuring appropriate safety protocols while enabling comprehensive assessment of aquatic conditions and infrastructure elements that would affect restoration planning and business development activities that characterized their entrepreneurial venture and income generation requirements. The pond construction had included sophisticated bottom contouring and substrate composition that exceeded normal recreational requirements, with structural elements and habitat features that indicated the water body had been designed to support specialized aquatic species and ecological activities that required enhanced environmental integrity and water quality management beyond normal fishing and aesthetic functions that characterize typical rural property water features. Additionally, The pond had included unexpected underwater structures and environmental controls that weren't typical of normal recreational areas or aesthetic water features, with circulation capabilities and habitat structures that suggested previous operational uses requiring precise environmental control and ecological management that characterize specialized conservation applications and sensitive operational activities rather than simple recreation and aesthetic functions. Mia's systematic documentation of underwater features had included measurements and photographs of structural elements, habitat structures, and infrastructure components that enabled comprehensive understanding of the pond's configuration and ecological capabilities while identifying construction details and equipment installations that suggested historical uses beyond normal recreational functions, and county record documentation that characterized their property, acquisition and ownership. Transfer. Her investigation methodology had combined scientific observation techniques with practical curiosity about aquatic systems and ecological details, enabling identification of environmental anomalies and infrastructure elements that indicated deliberate habitat creation and specialized construction work that exceeded normal recreational development, while incorporating features that weren't documented in available county records or property documentation. During her systematic pond exploration, Mia had discovered bottom sections that showed different substrate materials and techniques compared to surrounding structural elements, with habitat work and installation methods that indicated modification and enhancement activities that had been completed during different time periods using specialized construction approaches that weren't consistent with original property development and normal recreational construction practices. The pond construction anomalies had included sections that utilized different substrate compositions, habitat structures, and ecological techniques that suggested professional conservation work performed by specialists with experience in aquatic habitat development and specialized ecological restoration rather than normal recreational construction and standard development methods that characterize typical pond construction and rural infrastructure development that would have been appropriate for recreational fishing and aesthetic water features. Her systematic investigation had also revealed underwater habitat structures and equipment, mounting points that weren't typical of normal recreational areas or aesthetic water features, with infrastructure elements that suggested previous installation of sophisticated equipment and ecological systems that required specialized mounting capabilities and environmental controls that characterized advanced conservation operations rather than simple recreation and property enhancement functions. The underwater structures had incorporated stabilization, reinforcement, and habitat distribution systems that indicated previous installation of specialized equipment and operational systems that required substantial structural support and ecological integration beyond normal recreational equipment and property systems that characterized typical rural construction and infrastructure development that would have been appropriate for recreational fishing and aesthetic water features. Additionally, the pond had included environmental monitoring and water management infrastructure that exceeded normal property requirements, with dedicated sampling ports and equipment connections that suggested previous installation of sophisticated monitoring systems and water quality equipment that required specialized environmental support and operational capabilities that weren't typical of normal recreational property infrastructure and standard rural operations. The most significant discovery had occurred during Mia's investigation of what appeared to be a standard intake structure that county records described as housing basic water circulation systems. But her systematic exploration had revealed that the structure contained infrastructure elements and construction features that significantly exceeded normal pond management requirements, while incorporating specialized features that suggested operational purposes beyond basic water circulation and aesthetic management. The intake structure had included filtration systems with water purification capabilities that exceeded normal recreational requirements, incorporating specialized filters and water treatment equipment that suggested previous operational uses, requiring precise water quality control and contamination prevention that characterized conservation operations and sensitive ecological activities, rather than simple circulation and aesthetic systems. Additionally, the intake structure had contained equipment mounting systems and infrastructure elements that indicated previous installation of sophisticated machinery and operational equipment that required specialized environmental controls and operational support beyond normal property mechanical systems, with power distribution and control systems that suggested advanced technical operations rather than simple circulation functions. Mia's systematic investigation of the intake structure had revealed access panels and service connections that weren't documented in available property plans or county records, suggesting concealed infrastructure and operational capabilities that had been systematically hidden from official documentation and regulatory oversight that would normally be required for property operations and county compliance activities. Her investigation had revealed that certain sections within the intake structure responded differently to testing and showed construction characteristics that suggested concealed spaces and hidden access points that weren't visible during casual inspection, but that systematic investigation could identify through careful analysis of construction details and structural elements that indicated deliberate concealment and specialized construction work. The discovery of concealed access points had prompted more extensive investigation using borrowed tools and equipment that enabled systematic testing of structure construction and elements throughout the intake area, revealing that several sections contained hidden panels and access mechanisms that required specific manipulation techniques to activate properly without damaging concealment features that had been engineered to prevent casual discovery. Mia's systematic testing had eventually revealed activation sequences that enabled access to concealed spaces behind what appeared to be permanent structure construction, demonstrating that the intake structure contained hidden areas and specialized infrastructure that had been systematically concealed from normal property inspection and county oversight through sophisticated construction techniques and concealment methods that exceeded normal rural property development. The concealed spaces had contained infrastructure elements and equipment, installations that clearly indicated previous operational uses requiring specialized technical capabilities and conservation measures that weren't consistent with normal recreational functions and rural operations that would have characterized the property's documented historical use and county record documentation that had been available during their property acquisition and ownership transfer processes. The infrastructure within concealed areas had included filtration systems, monitoring equipment, and environmental controls that indicated sophisticated operational capabilities and technical requirements that exceeded anything justified by normal recreational functions while incorporating features and access controls that suggested highly specialized and potentially sensitive conservation activities that required absolute concealment from official oversight and public knowledge. Mia's documentation of concealed infrastructure included photographs and measurements that provided comprehensive evidence of specialized construction and equipment installation that clearly exceeded normal recreational capabilities while incorporating features that indicated previous operational uses requiring advanced technical support and conservation measures that weren't documented in available county records or property documentation. Her systematic approach to documenting concealed discoveries had combined scientific methodology with practical investigation techniques that enabled comprehensive understanding of the property's actual configuration and capabilities while maintaining detailed records that could support further investigation and analysis of the property's complete history and previous operational uses that weren't reflected in official documentation and county records. The discovery of concealed infrastructure and specialized construction had prompted Eleanor to conduct her own investigation of the concealed areas and hidden infrastructure that Mia had documented, confirming that their property acquisition had provided them with a facility that contained sophisticated technical capabilities and specialized construction that significantly exceeded anything justified by normal recreational operations and rural property functionality. Eleanor's professional assessment of the concealed infrastructure had revealed equipment installations and operational capabilities that indicated previous uses, requiring advanced technical expertise and specialized operational procedures that were consistent with conservation and environmental research activities rather than recreational property services, suggesting that the facility had been systematically modified and enhanced for purposes that weren't documented in available county records or property documentation. Her analysis of filtration and monitoring systems within concealed areas had indicated sophisticated operational capabilities that included water quality processing equipment, biological monitoring networks, and environmental data systems that were consistent with advanced conservation facilities and technical operations that required specialized infrastructure and security measures beyond anything justified by normal recreational functions and rural operations. The systematic investigation of concealed areas had also revealed storage systems and equipment installations that indicated previous operational uses involving materials, handling and processing activities that required specialized containment, and environmental controls beyond normal recreational capabilities, suggesting that the property had been used for technical operations that required advanced safety measures and operational procedures. The discovery of sophisticated concealed infrastructure had raised immediate questions about the property's complete history and previous operational uses that weren't documented in available county records, suggesting that significant activities had been conducted within the property during ownership periods that required systematic concealment from official oversight and public knowledge through specialized construction and infrastructure development that exceeded normal recreational capabilities. Eleanor's recognition that their property acquisition had provided them with a facility containing unexplained infrastructure and specialized construction had created both opportunities and concerns about their situation, as the concealed capabilities could potentially support their ecological tourism business development while simultaneously raising questions about previous activities and potential regulatory compliance issues that could affect their ability to operate legitimate business activities within the property. The investigation of concealed infrastructure had also revealed that their desperate property acquisition had connected them to historical activities and operational capabilities that extended far beyond normal rural property ownership, potentially providing them with resources and capabilities that could address their financial crisis while simultaneously exposing them to unknown risks and complications associated with the property's actual history and previous uses that weren't reflected in official documentation and county records that had characterized their acquisition process. The third week of March had brought the discovery that would transform Eleanor and Mia's desperate property acquisition from a questionable business venture into something that challenged every assumption about the property's documented history and legitimate recreational purposes. When Mia's systematic investigation of the concealed access panels revealed entry points to underwater chambers that county records categorically denied existed beneath the pond, containing preserved documentation and equipment that proved the pond had served as a covert research facility for the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary, a classified conservation project that extended far beyond anything suggested by the sophisticated infrastructure they had already discovered. Mia's successful activation of the concealed access mechanisms had required 3 days of systematic experimentation with different manipulation techniques and sequential operations that combined her analytical problem-solving approach with persistent environmental curiosity that enabled her to identify the precise timing and pressure combinations necessary to operate hidden panels, without triggering protection features that had been designed to prevent unauthorized access while enabling legitimate researchers to enter concealed areas through procedures that required specific knowledge and technical understanding. The activation sequence had involved simultaneous manipulation of waterproof switches concealed within false intake panels, mechanical pressure points hidden beneath removable grate sections, and rotational mechanisms integrated into what appeared to be standard filtration fixtures, demonstrating engineering sophistication and security design that exceeded anything justified by normal recreational protection, while incorporating features that required coordinated operation by multiple individuals, with detailed knowledge of access procedures and security protocols. When the concealed access systems finally responded to Mia's persistent investigation and systematic testing, the result had been revelation of a sealed underwater chamber approximately 12 feet beneath the pond's surface, connected to a shoreline access tunnel that had been expertly disguised as an ordinary drainage culvert, using professional construction techniques and camouflage methods that indicated substantial resource investment and specialized expertise that wouldn't have been available for normal recreational property development during the facility's documented construction period. The underwater chamber had been accessed through a reinforced waterproof door system that incorporated multiple sealing mechanisms and security features, including electronic access controls, mechanical deadbolts, and emergency closure capabilities that indicated the concealed areas had been designed to contain sensitive materials and operational activities, while providing absolute protection from unauthorized access and potential security breaches that could compromise operational integrity. And classified materials protection. Eleanor's initial assessment of the underwater facility had revealed construction quality and engineering sophistication that exceeded anything she had encountered during her environmental research career, with water pressure management, structural reinforcement, and infrastructure capabilities that indicated the concealed chambers had been designed to support advanced technical operations, requiring laboratory-quality environmental control and operational security that characterized classified research facilities rather than recreational property auxiliary space. The underwater construction had incorporated professional hydrological engineering and excavation techniques that enabled creation of permanent facilities within North Carolina's challenging geological conditions and mountain watersheds, demonstrating resource investment and technical expertise that would have required coordination with specialized contractors and engineering firms whose capabilities exceeded normal rural construction industry resources and standard property development practices. The primary underwater chamber measured approximately 30 feet in length and 20 feet in width, with ceiling heights that provided comfortable working space while maintaining structural integrity through reinforced concrete construction and steel support systems that enabled long-term occupancy and equipment operation within environmental conditions that had been precisely controlled through sophisticated water management and atmospheric systems that maintained laboratory-quality water purity and contamination prevention. The chamber's environmental controls had included water filtration systems with multiple redundancy levels, monitoring equipment that maintained precise temperature and chemical specifications, and contamination prevention measures that indicated previous operational uses involving biological specimens and sensitive species that required absolute environmental control and safety protocols that characterized advanced research facilities and classified conservation operations rather than normal recreational or academic research activities. Additionally, the primary chamber had contained equipment, mounting systems and infrastructure elements that indicated previous installation of sophisticated research instruments and analytical equipment that required specialized electrical power, environmental isolation, and operational support that characterized advanced biological research and scientific investigation activities that required laboratory quality facilities and technical capabilities that exceeded normal property infrastructure and operational requirements. MIA's systematic documentation of the underwater facility had revealed that the primary chamber connected to additional rooms and specialized areas through a corridor system that extended beyond the immediate excavation, suggesting that the concealed facility encompassed substantially more space and operational capability than their initial discovery had indicated, while incorporating design features that enabled expansion and modification of operational areas, according to research requirements and security considerations. The corridor system had been constructed using the same professional excavation and engineering techniques that characterized the primary chamber, with structural reinforcement and environmental controls that enabled safe passage and operational access throughout the underwater facility, while maintaining security features and access controls that could isolate different areas and restrict access according to operational requirements and security classifications that govern different research activities and materials handling procedures. Her investigation of the corridor system had revealed access points to 3 additional chambers, whose construction and configuration indicated specialized operational purposes, including specimen storage, breeding programs, and data processing activities that required dedicated space and environmental controls, beyond the capabilities provided by the primary chamber, while incorporating security measures that enabled controlled access and operational isolation according to research protocols and security requirements. The first additional chamber had been configured as a specimen storage facility with environmental controls and containment systems that indicated previous use for endangered freshwater mussels and aquatic species that required specialized storage conditions and safety protocols, including temperature regulation capabilities, water quality controls, and containment measures that characterized advanced conservation operations and research activities involving sensitive species and ecological preservation that required professional handling and safety procedures. The storage chamber had contained specialized equipment, including aquatic habitat units, species segregation systems, and biological containment devices that demonstrated previous operational use for conservation activities requiring materials handling and storage capabilities that exceeded normal laboratory infrastructure, while incorporating safety features and environmental controls that characterized classified research operations and government facility standards rather than normal conservation or academic research activities. Additionally, the storage chamber had included specimen management systems and documentation procedures that indicated systematic tracking and control of endangered species and ecological specimens that required detailed record-keeping and accountability measures, consistent with government research protocols and security requirements that govern classified materials handling and operational accountability within sensitive research environments and federal facility operations. The second additional chamber had been equipped as an operational laboratory with scientific instruments and analytical equipment that demonstrated previous use for advanced ecological research and technical analysis activities that required sophisticated instrumentation and operational capabilities that exceeded normal conservation laboratory infrastructure, while incorporating security features and access controls that characterized classified research facilities and government operations. The laboratory equipment had included water chemistry analysis systems, DNA sequencing instruments, aquatic habitat monitoring capabilities, and biological processing equipment that indicated research activities involving genetic preservation, ecological restoration, and species propagation that required advanced technical capabilities and specialized expertise that characterized cutting-edge conservation, research, and endangered species protection activities that would have required substantial funding and institutional support. Additionally, the laboratory chamber had contained data processing systems and communication equipment that enabled real-time monitoring and analysis of research activities while providing secure communication capabilities and data transmission that indicated coordination with external research institutions and government agencies whose involvement in conservation activities required absolute security and operational confidentiality that characterized classified research programs and federal agency coordination. The third additional chamber had been configured as a breeding facility with specialized aquatic habitats and environmental systems that indicated previous use for endangered species, propagation and ecological preservation activities that required advanced technical capabilities and security measures that characterize sensitive conservation operations and classified biological preservation rather than normal research support and administrative functions that would have been appropriate for legitimate scientific research activities. The breeding facility had included specialized habitat reproduction systems, water quality maintenance networks, and species isolation capabilities that demonstrated operational use for endangered species preservation and genetic diversity activities that required advanced technical capabilities and security measures that exceeded normal research facility requirements while incorporating features that characterized federal conservation operations and classified biological preservation activities. Eleanor's professional assessment of the underwater laboratory equipment had revealed instrumentation and analytical capabilities that indicated research activities involving freshwater pearl mussels and endangered aquatic species that required advanced ecological equipment and specialized procedures that characterized conservation research and species preservation, but had incorporated security measures and operational isolation that suggested activities that were conducted without normal public awareness and institutional accountability that characterized legitimate environmental research and conservation development. The most significant discovery had been filing cabinets and storage systems throughout the underwater facility that contained comprehensive documentation of research activities and operational procedures that proved the pond had served as a covert research facility for a classified government program designated Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary that had conducted systematic endangered species preservation and ecological restoration activities between 1967 and 1989 without public knowledge or regulatory oversight due to the economic implications of the discoveries that had been systematically concealed through deceptive procedures and fraudulent environmental assessments. The Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary documentation had included research protocols and conservation procedures that detailed systematic preservation efforts involving water quality remediation, habitat reconstruction, and species propagation activities that had been conducted through classified operations that had been systematically concealed about the nature and purposes of the facility while developing treatments and procedures that could have revolutionized ecological restoration and endangered species protection throughout the Appalachian watershed. The research documentation had revealed that the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been conducted under the authority of the Department of Interior in coordination with mining companies and timber operations that had provided research funding and operational support for conservation activities that were designed to develop remediation techniques and ecological preservation capabilities for environmental and economic applications that required testing on endangered species without public knowledge or regulatory oversight that could have restricted industrial operations throughout the region. The program documentation had included detailed records of over 15,000 acres of watershed that had been systematically affected by industrial activities throughout Appalachia, including mining operations, logging companies, and chemical manufacturing that had provided access to contaminated watersheds, including mountain streams, underground aquifers, and threatened habitats that had been targeted for experimental restoration without public knowledge while being subjected to continued industrial degradation that compromised remediation efforts. MIA's systematic review of the research documentation had revealed that Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary subjects had included at least 7 species now believed extinct in the wild, preserved through experimental procedures including specialized breeding programs, genetic preservation techniques, habitat recreation systems, and water quality management protocols that exceeded anything achieved through public conservation efforts, while incorporating biological preservation methods that had never been shared with mainstream conservation organizations or scientific researchers working to prevent ecological collapse throughout Appalachia's threatened watersheds. The species files had contained comprehensive documentation of conservation cases, including habitat requirements, pollution sensitivity thresholds, reproductive success rates, and survival measurements that demonstrated systematic tracking and analysis of ecological preservation effects while maintaining detailed records that enabled research continuity and data analysis throughout extended experimental periods that had involved decades of systematic research and ecological preservation activities that could have prevented numerous extinction events. Additionally, the documentation had revealed that the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been coordinated with multiple federal agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Environmental Protection Agency, and Forest Service that had provided institutional support and research coordination for conservation activities, while maintaining operational security and public denial that prevented exposure of the economic implications and industrial accountability that characterized the programs. Systematic evidence gathering regarding environmental destruction and habitat degradation. The program documentation had also included correspondence with resource extraction companies, including major corporations whose names appeared in contemporary mining and timber operations, proving that legitimate industrial institutions and commercial enterprises had provided research funding and operational support for conservation activities while maintaining institutional protection and legal immunity through classified program status and government coordination that prevented accountability and legal consequences that characterized the program's systematic documentation of industrial pollution and ecological destruction. The corporate documentation had also included correspondence with regulatory agencies and inspection departments that had falsified environmental assessments and compliance reports for operations that had created devastating ecological damage, demonstrating systematic suppression of scientific records and research, documentation that could expose illegal activities, and coordination with regulatory authorities that prevented investigation and prosecution of corporate entities whose activities violated federal law and environmental protection standards. Additionally, the cover-up activities had included systematic intimidation and elimination of scientific whistleblowers and research personnel who had attempted to expose illegal activities or withdraw from program participation, with documentation proving that the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been systematically undermined through corporate influence and political pressure to maintain operational security while preventing exposure of activities that would have triggered federal investigation and regulatory enforcement against powerful industrial interests. The documentation had also revealed that communities affected by industrial pollution had been systematically deceived through falsified environmental explanations and fraudulent health investigations that prevented accurate determination of disease causes while providing institutional protection for corporate entities and government agencies whose activities had resulted in systematic environmental destruction and public health emergencies that affected thousands of Appalachian families throughout multiple states and watersheds. MIA's comprehensive review of the cover-up documentation had revealed that the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been undermined, Through systematic coordination with multiple federal agencies and institutional authorities that had provided legal immunity and operational protection to polluting industries while preventing congressional oversight and public accountability. That would have exposed the program's systematic documentation of federal law violations and environmental degradation that threatened public health and ecological integrity throughout the region. The protection mechanisms had included coordination with regulatory enforcement agencies that had prevented investigation of ecological degradation and illegal pollution, systematic suppression of scientific inquiries and oversight activities through classified program status and economic priority claims, and coordination with local governments that had prevented public reporting and exposure of activities that would have triggered community outrage and demands for accountability and legal prosecution against powerful industrial interests with significant economic and political influence throughout the region. The systematic nature of institutional protection and cover-up activities had demonstrated that the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary represented only one component of a comprehensive ecological preservation program that had been conducted through multiple facilities and institutional partnerships throughout the eastern United States between 1963 and 1992, with coordination centers in North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky that had enabled systematic conservation activities involving dozens of endangered species while maintaining operational security through federal agency protection and institutional conspiracy that prevented exposure and accountability for nearly 4 decades of systematic environmental degradation. The multi-facility coordination had been documented through communication records and administrative correspondence that proved systematic planning and resource sharing among research locations that had enabled comprehensive conservation programs while maintaining operational security through compartmentalized activities and limited information access that characterized compartmentalized government operations and classified research programs that required absolute secrecy and security measures to prevent industrial accountability and economic consequences. Additionally, the multi-facility network had enabled systematic data sharing and research coordination that had maximized the scientific value and operational utility of endangered species preservation results while maintaining institutional protection through federal agency oversight and classified program status that prevented congressional investigation and public accountability for activities that documented federal law violations and environmental degradation threatening ecological integrity throughout the Appalachian watershed and surrounding communities. The institutional coordination had extended beyond government research facilities to encompass major universities and conservation institutions whose participation in the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had provided academic legitimacy and research expertise, while enabling systematic integration of classified research results into legitimate scientific investigation and environmental education that had influenced generations of conservation professionals and ecological researchers, whose training and professional development had been systematically limited by withholding critical knowledge and techniques derived from successful preservation methods. The university participation had been documented through research contracts and coordination agreements with institutions including North Carolina State University, University of Tennessee, Virginia Tech, West Virginia University, and the University of Kentucky, whose faculty and research programs had provided expertise and institutional support for conservation activities while receiving federal funding and research access that had contributed to academic advancement and institutional prestige derived from partial disclosure of successful ecological restoration projects and species preservation techniques. The academic institutional involvement had included systematic recruitment of graduate students and research personnel who had been systematically restricted from full knowledge about the nature and purposes of their research participation while being trained in experimental techniques and research methods that incorporated knowledge and procedures derived from classified conservation programs, creating ongoing institutional limitation and professional restrictions that continued to influence contemporary environmental research and academic investigation. Eleanor's analysis of university documentation had revealed that academic participation in the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been coordinated through classified research contracts and institutional agreements that had provided substantial federal funding for environmental research programs while requiring absolute secrecy and operational security that prevented academic disclosure and comprehensive publication that would have enabled widespread implementation of successful conservation techniques that could have prevented numerous extinction events and ecological degradation throughout similar watersheds. The academic coordination had also included systematic suppression of research publications and disclosure mechanisms within participating institutions through federal pressure and funding, dependencies that had compromised institutional contributions and professional advancement while enabling ongoing participation in activities that restricted academic dissemination standards and professional responsibilities that governed legitimate environmental research and scientific investigation within university settings. The corporate industry participation in the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary had been even more systematic and comprehensive than academic involvement, encompassing major corporations including Mountain Coal Enterprises, Appalachian Timber Corporation, Eastern Chemical Manufacturing, Blue Ridge Mining, and Carolina Watershed Industries, whose extraction and development activities had been systematically shielded from environmental accountability, while receiving operational protection and regulatory exemptions that had generated billions of dollars in revenue, while contributing to environmental destruction and ecological collapse of fragile watersheds and endangered species habitats. The corporate coordination had included systematic resistance to environmental remediation requirements and restoration obligations that would have characterized legitimate industrial operations in sensitive ecological areas, enabling corporations to continue destructive practices that would have been prohibited under normal regulatory frameworks, while receiving governmental protection and legislative advantages that contributed to commercial profitability and market advantages derived from avoiding environmental compliance and ecological restoration costs. The corporate documentation had revealed that extraction companies had systematically utilized political influence and economic pressure to undermine the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary's conservation data and experimental results that had been developed to restore watersheds and protect endangered species that had been systematically harmed by industrial operations that generated substantial profits while devastating ecological systems and threatening community health throughout the Appalachian region. Additionally, the corporate involvement had included systematic coordination with federal agencies to suppress research results and ecological data that would have exposed harmful effects and destructive outcomes associated with industrial operations and extraction. Procedures that had been documented through classified research, enabling corporations to avoid liability and regulatory consequences while maintaining commercial advantages derived from environmental destruction and systematic avoidance of restoration responsibilities. The corporate participation had also extended to systematic lobbying and institutional pressure against research facilities and personnel whose activities had been dedicated to species preservation and habitat restoration research that threatened industrial profit margins and extraction access, creating ongoing obstruction and mutual antagonism that had enabled decades of systematic environmental degradation while generating substantial profits and institutional advantages for participating corporations at the expense of ecological integrity and community health. Mia's investigation of contemporary connections had revealed that many of the institutions and corporations that had participated in undermining the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary continued to maintain influential positions within modern environmental policy, natural resource extraction, and government regulation through personnel who had been directly involved in obstructive activities or institutional leadership that had inherited responsibility for ongoing concealment and protection of historical environmental crimes while maintaining institutional authority and commercial success built upon ecological destruction and community harm. The contemporary institutional connections had included identification of current executives and operations, directors at major extraction companies whose career advancement had been based on profitability and production derived from environmentally destructive practices, creating ongoing institutional liability and professional compromise that required continued concealment and protection to prevent exposure of historical crimes and ongoing institutional complicity in systematic environmental violations and community health impacts. Additionally, the contemporary analysis had revealed that current government officials and regulatory administrators included personnel whose career development had been influenced by industrial relationships and corporate protection, creating ongoing governmental complicity and administrative pressure to maintain favorable treatment and prevent accountability for historical crimes that would expose current leadership to legal liability and professional consequences for ongoing relationships with destructive industrial practices and ecological degradation. The modern institutional protection had been maintained through systematic coordination among government agencies, extraction corporations, and regulatory institutions whose ongoing collaboration in environmental policy and development approvals had required continued suppression of historical evidence and prevention of accountability proceedings that would expose institutional participation in systematic environmental violations and destructive activities that continued to influence contemporary operations and institutional authority. Eleanor's recognition that their discovery represented evidence that could expose ongoing institutional conspiracy and contemporary corporate complicity had created immediate security concerns and personal safety risks that exceeded anything their family's financial crisis had prepared them to understand or manage. When their accidental property acquisition had transformed them from desperate homeowners into potential witnesses whose knowledge could threaten institutional legitimacy and personal safety through exposure of crimes that modern power structures had been systematically designed to conceal and protect. The documentation had proven that institutional protection and cover-up activities had included systematic intimidation and elimination of conservation advocates and research personnel who had attempted to expose illegal activities or withdraw from program participation, with detailed records of careers destroyed, reputations ruined, and systematic harassment that had been utilized to maintain operational security, while preventing exposure of activities that would have triggered federal investigation and environmental accountability proceedings against politically connected corporations with significant influence throughout governmental regulatory systems. The witness intimidation activities had been coordinated through corporate security divisions and institutional protection organizations that had utilized professional harassment capabilities and systematic legal pressure to neutralize threats to operational security, while maintaining plausible deniability and prevention of investigation that would have exposed systematic obstruction and corporate conspiracy that characterized institutional protection of industrial operations that violated environmental regulations and endangered community health throughout the Appalachian region. Mia's analysis of witness intimidation documentation had revealed that researchers and conservationists who had attempted to expose illegal activities had been systematically targeted through coordinated litigation, economic pressure, and professional isolation that had been designed to prevent testimony and evidence disclosure while maintaining Institutional protection through systematic intimidation and corporate legal resources that exceeded normal security. Measures and legal protection activities available to individual researchers and conservation advocates. The systematic nature of witness intimidation and institutional protection had demonstrated that contemporary corporations whose profitability depended on concealing environmental violations possessed resources and capabilities for neutralization or intimidation that exceeded typical individual defense capabilities through coordination with legal departments and institutional authorities, whose protection required ongoing concealment and prevention of accountability through overwhelming legal resources and economic pressure against environmental advocates and researchers. But Eleanor's conservation background and environmental research experience had taught her that institutional transparency and public exposure often provided better protection than secrecy and institutional cooperation when evidence of systematic environmental crimes could benefit society while protecting families through visibility and public awareness that made covert intimidation difficult for corporations whose public image depended on maintaining community relationships and environmental appearances that could be compromised through exposure of crimes that modern power structures had been systematically designed to conceal and protect. The initial contact with environmental journalists had been coordinated through secure communication methods and verification procedures that had enabled authentication of documentary evidence while maintaining operational security and family protection through professional journalism standards and legal protections that characterized legitimate environmental investigation and public interest. Reporting that served community health and ecological protection objectives. The journalistic investigation had been conducted by teams of experienced environmental reporters from major news organizations including National Geographic, The Washington Post, and The Guardian, whose professional expertise and institutional resources had enabled comprehensive verification of documentary evidence, while providing legal protection and security measures that exceeded anything individual families could achieve through normal legal representation and governmental assistance. The news organizations had coordinated with federal environmental agencies, including the EPA's Environmental Crimes Division and the Department of Justice's Environmental and Natural Resources Division, to ensure appropriate legal authority and investigative coordination while maintaining journalistic independence and public accountability that served both environmental protection objectives and community health requirements that characterized legitimate investigation of corporate crimes and institutional accountability. The federal investigation had been launched within days of initial journalistic contact, encompassing comprehensive forensic analysis of Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary documentation, authentication of research records and environmental evidence, and coordinated investigation of contemporary institutional connections that indicated ongoing corporate conspiracy and cover-up activities that required immediate law enforcement intervention and legal proceedings to prevent continued environmental crimes and institutional protection of historical ecological destruction. The EPA investigation had included establishment of federal witness protection services for Eleanor and Mia that had provided immediate security measures and legal representation while enabling their continued cooperation with federal authorities, whose investigation required comprehensive documentation and testimony that would support environmental prosecution and ecological rights litigation against corporations and individuals whose participation in systematic environmental violations had continued to influence contemporary operations and institutional authority. The federal witness protection had also included immediate financial assistance and housing security that had resolved their family's economic crisis while enabling Eleanor to pursue conservation work and ecological restoration that honored their accidental discovery and contributed to environmental proceedings that served both endangered species preservation and broader public interest in ecological protection and community health that prevented ongoing environmental degradation and corporate pollution. The Department of Justice proceedings had resulted in comprehensive legal action, including criminal prosecution of corporate executives and institutional administrators whose participation in environmental crimes could be proven through documentary evidence, ecological rights litigation against corporations whose ongoing operations had caused environmental harm, and restoration proceedings that provided financial settlements for comprehensive watershed remediation and ecosystem rehabilitation throughout affected Appalachian communities and fragile ecological habitats. The settlement funds had been allocated to establish the Appalachian Watershed Restoration Trust, a $1.8 million endowment that would provide ongoing funding for ecological remediation, species preservation, and community health initiatives throughout the affected region, with Eleanor appointed as the Trust's executive director and primary administrator responsible for implementing comprehensive restoration programs and educational initiatives that would transform decades of environmental degradation into community healing and ecological restoration. The international conservation proceedings had been coordinated through World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and international ecological protection institutions that had investigated the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary as a pioneering conservation model whose suppressed techniques and preservation methods could be implemented worldwide to prevent extinction events and ecological collapse in similar watersheds and fragile ecosystems facing industrial development and resource extraction pressures. The international investigation had also resulted in comprehensive reform of environmental protection methods and governmental oversight mechanisms that had been implemented throughout participating countries to enhance species preservation and ensure ongoing accountability and transparency that protected ecological integrity, while enabling legitimate industrial development and resource utilization that served economic objectives without compromising environmental standards and habitat protection. Remarkably, the underwater facility's specimen storage chambers had contained viable pearl mussel populations from 7 species previously declared extinct, with breeding populations and genetic preservation systems that could support reintroduction and habitat restoration throughout their historical range. Using the sanctuary's pioneering conservation techniques and ecological restoration methods that had been systematically concealed from mainstream conservation organizations and environmental researchers whose limited preservation success had been constrained by lack of access to these revolutionary methods and techniques. Today, Eleanor serves as executive director of the Appalachian Watershed Restoration Trust, while Mia continues developing her environmental passion and conservation skills through specialized educational programs and mentorship opportunities that honor their contribution to ecological justice and species preservation. Their mountain pond has been transformed into the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Conservation Center, a thriving ecological education facility and species preservation research center that documents environmental restoration and industrial accountability, while providing educational resources and conservation services that serve ongoing ecological rehabilitation and community healing processes. The Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary revelations have triggered comprehensive reform of environmental protection oversight, extraction industry regulation, and ecological accountability mechanisms that have enhanced ongoing conservation activity, while establishing institutional transparency and democratic oversight that protect endangered species and serve public interest in legitimate environmental protection and industrial operations that respect ecological integrity and community health rather than corporate protection and industrial immunity that had characterized previous approaches to environmental regulation and accountability. The comprehensive exposure of the Appalachian Pearl Mussel Sanctuary and industrial conspiracy has demonstrated that individual courage and systematic investigation can overcome institutional power and corporate secrecy when evidence of environmental crime serves broader public interest and ecological accountability, providing hope and practical examples for ongoing efforts to ensure environmental protection and institutional integrity that preserve endangered species while serving legitimate economic development and resource utilization objectives through sustainable processes and ecological oversight rather than systematic destruction and corporate conspiracy. Eleanor often reflects that what began as a desperate $1 property purchase to avoid homelessness became the catalyst for environmental justice, worth $1.8 million in restoration funding and priceless ecological preservation of species thought forever lost. Sometimes our greatest challenges hide unexpected gifts, she tells visitors at the conservation center. When we were facing eviction with nowhere to go, I never imagined that a dead mountain pond would become our salvation and the key to saving entire ecosystems. It reminds me that even in our darkest moments, possibility remains. We just need the courage to keep exploring beneath the surface. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.